State Department has eliminated Colombia as a warning for travelers. It means that school groups and PITT groups can now travel again to Colombia. Tourism is on the rise, and cities that only a few years ago no one would have considered to go as a destination, regardless of their natural beauty and friendliness, and their citizens are now an important destination. Tensions are still high, however, because the proposed peace deal, about which we'll hear much more from our esteemed and knowledgeable colleagues, commentators, does not resolve all of the issues and provide the retribution or the justice that many people want and deserve. I would argue that the deal necessarily has these limitations. You do make peace with your enemies, not with your friends. And deals have to involve trade-offs from both sides. A deal where one side wins will not hold, since the other side will feel cheated and want to fight back. The goal of this type of deal is a long-term peace. Will it work? No one can know, and probably every deal has a low probability of real success. But these odds have to be weighed against the costs of no deal. Some call for harsher terms, but would they be accepted? And if they could be imposed, what would be the long-term consequences of a harsh retribution? Lessons from other conflicts, including post-apartheid South Africa, or maybe from the region that we know better, South America or Latin America, you can think of post-Pinochet Chile, post-Dirty War Argentina, Guatemala, etc., have shown that truth commissions, reconciliation, and integration of former combatants, while have not created perfect peace by any sense, are crucial to and leads to a better chance for long-term peace in keeping the military in their barracks. The devil, however, of any deal is in the details. The two sides have signed a deal that you can read online. It's about 300 pages long. The document deals with finances, land reform, truth commissions, and many promises. Can it be implemented? We don't know. Can the government and the ex-combatants oversee what the other is doing? That's going to be a difficulty. Can the FARC turn itself into a viable political party? And if it does, what kinds of policies will it promote, and how will citizens respond to that political party? I'm very much looking forward to hearing the responses from our three respondents that we're going to have here in a moment. We have three speakers tonight, two of whom are joining us via video hookup from the Universidad de los Andes, who are PITT PhDs, and the third person who grants PITT PhDs here at PITT. First, we're going to have Miguel Garcia, who's going to be our first speaker. He is the co-director, he's the associate professor of political science at the Universidad de los Andes, and co-director of Observatorio de la Democracia. His presentation will be on the political participation part of the agreement, and he's going to look at the public opinion polls. Second, let me introduce all three people. First, we'll have Juan Raga, who's also an associate professor at the Universidad de los Andes and the other co-director of the Observatorio de la Democracia. He also runs the America's Barometer, a survey for Colombia. He's written about political reform, elections, and political institutions. And he's going to talk about the referendum, I believe. And finally, Professor Michael Kenney, associate professor from Garcia, Public Policy School here one floor below us, who has written a book called From Pablo to Osama, and based on field work that he's done in Colombia about the drug trafficking networks. So I want to thank you all three very much for agreeing to do this. I'm personally very much looking forward to hearing and learning from you all. Thank you. So again, we'll start with Miguel.
Okay, thank you, Scott. I would like to know if you can hear me. Yes. All right. This is kind of weird. So I would like to start. Thank you for inviting me. It's very nice to feel that I'm closer to Pittsburgh, though I'm only connected through this machine. But I feel very happy to be back there with you guys. So as Scott mentioned, I would like to talk about a part of the deal, a part of the agreement, which is the political participation, a part of the agreement, and I would like to discuss some of the implications of that agreement and the challenges we are facing in terms of the political participation of the FARC from a public opinion perspective. There are many challenges that we can discuss, but I would like to focus on the public opinion dimension of this particular issue. So basically, as I just mentioned, I will do a very, very brief presentation of the agreement on political participation. As Scott mentioned, the agreement is almost 300 pages long, and the agreement on political participation may be between 25 to 40 pages. So what I'm going to do is a very, very brief presentation. And after that presentation of the political participation agreement, I would like to talk about the challenges we are facing in terms of political participation of the FARC, of the political party that will be created after the FARC demobilizes, from a public opinion perspective. So let's start with the agreement. The agreement on political participation basically has 4 dimensions. Some of them are related with issues that are part of the Constitution, that are part of the everyday political life, in Colombia, and some other are new issues, are of course the concessions that the Colombian government is making to the FARC. So the first dimension, before talking about the first dimension, I would like you to think the FARC as a political actor. That's something we have to keep in mind. We are talking about an armed group that thinks about itself in terms of a political actor, and that's why we end up negotiating with them. It's something that I think sometimes is missed from the discussion about the negotiation. And the second thing I would like to have, that I would like to highlight before presenting the agreement, is that the FARC is thinking about the political party that will come in the future as a minority. And they have this perspective of acting in politics in terms of a social movement. They don't like political parties. They talk about themselves in terms of a future political party, but in reality they are thinking about themselves as a social movement. That's the way they have deciphered themselves in the past. So keep in mind these two particular issues. So the first dimension, it comes to rights and protection of the opposition. Look that the agreement is not talking about only the rights and protection of the FARC, and the agreement starts with the rights and the protection of the opposition. So the FARC negotiated something in relation with themselves, but also in terms of the opposition. And the first dimension is what is called the opposition statute, or the Estatuto de la Oposición, which is part of the political debate in Colombia for the last 20 years, or 15 years. It's something that the Congress of Colombia has not been able or willing to regulate. So the first thing that I would like to highlight is the fact that something that regular legislation has been almost impossible to approve is part of the agreement. And the second dimension, which is critical, is a system of protection for the opposition, which is basically a system of protection for the former combatants that will act in the political realm, and they are very worried about their physical security. So that's part of this first dimension. The second one are a series of mechanisms to promote political participation and inclusion. So those mechanisms include protection again, more voice for social movements and for minorities, for political minorities, funds, and access to media. They are very concerned about the fact that they right now have a network or clandestine radio stations. So they want to have access to media and have access to mechanisms that allow them to participate in politics. These first two dimensions, I think, are not very surprising from my point of view. Then we have the third dimension, which implies some reforms, considering the actual set of institutions we have in the country. And those reforms are under actions to promote political pluralism. And the first one, which is very interesting and kind of surprising to me, but it's easy to understand, is the elimination of the electoral threshold for political parties. Right now, parties, in order to keep the legal status, need to obtain a minimum percentage of votes in every election. So that threshold would be eliminated, at least for two electoral periods. So that will benefit minorities, and of course will benefit the party that will be created after the peace agreements. And the second element of this third dimension are changes in the electoral system to promote political pluralism. I have to tell you that this is probably the most ambiguous part of the agreement in terms of political participation, because basically what we know right now is that the government and the FARC are going to agree to form a commission of experts, hopefully some of us will be there, to redesign the electoral system. But basically, we exactly don't know the nature of the electoral system. There will be changes, but we don't know exactly the nature of those changes. And finally, the dimension on political representation. Probably this is something you have heard recently, because this is the dimension or the part of the agreement of political participation that is creating more noise and debate. Basically, because we're gonna have a new electoral district, and a district to represent areas traditionally affected by conflict and by coca cultivation, of 16 seats. The thing that I think that I consider more interesting here is that the 16 seats are not for the FARC, are 16 seats that will be the product of political competition in those particular areas. From what I read, it seems that there will be 16 districts, single-member districts or something like that, to elect the 16 representatives. And finally, for the legislative, from the electoral periods going from 2018 to 2020 to 2022 and 2022 to 2026, we'll have 5 seats for the FARC in the House and 5 seats in the Senate, which there will be some competition. They have to go to elections, but if they are not getting the votes to obtain the 10 seats, in any case they're going to have the difference. So at the end they will have the 10 seats in the Congress. So this is the 4 main dimensions, and as I said before, this is a very, very brief presentation of the agreement. Some of these issues are necessary, imply protection to minorities, to small parties. Some of these issues have been debated in Colombia since the 91 Constitution, and some of these issues are clear concessions to the FARC. So this is the way I decipher this political participation agreement. So once I presented this political participation agreement, I would like to talk about the challenges, how to see this political participation agreement from the point of view of the public opinion, and what are the challenges in general we are facing to implement this political participation agreement. The first one is that Colombians don't want to see, or don't see the FARC as a political actor. Doesn't make their challenge. Colombians see the FARC as criminals, as a guerrilla that has been there for many, many years, and they don't see this organization as a political actor, which is a a major problem because if you don't see the FARC as a political actor, you cannot imagine them as a political party. Although 60% of Colombians support negotiated peace for the past 15 years or more than 10 some years, only 20% support that the government gives them the conditions to participate in politics, and only 18% approves the idea of the FARC transforming into a political party, which is, you know, see here the paradox. We want a negotiated peace, but a peace that we are deciphering in terms of just as them disappearing from the political arena, but that's not going to happen. So the first challenge is to start to think about them in terms of political actors. So here are some of the some graphs that will show you exactly what I mentioned before. This is the evolution of support for a negotiated. On your right, you see the support for a negotiated areas traditionally affected by conflict. 2015 ME, which is a special sample we did last year in municipalities affected by conflict, and in fact, in those areas, support for a negotiation is higher. And these are the two other graphs that show you the gap, the tremendous gap between the support for a negotiated peace versus the fact that the FARC form a political party or get the conditions to participate in politics. And the last one shows you the voting intention for a candidate of the FARC. So here's probably the good news for some of you that may feel that this will be Castro Chavismo, which is not the case. They don't have electoral, they probably won't have electoral support in the near future. These are this is a graph for our previous surveys. Okay, this is the first challenge. The second challenge is to guarantee physical integrity for former members of the FARC. And I would like to stress this particular challenge basically because that's their main fear. Because as you may know, when they negotiated back in the 80s with the Cancun government and formed the Unión Patriótica, 3,000 members of Unión Patriótica were killed between mid-80s and the late 90s. So that's a real threat. And despite the fact that Colombia is a safer country than 2 decades ago, and the conflict has diminished a lot, almost to zero, opposition leaders and social movement leaders still facing several threats to their lives. So, and in the actual political polarization, I think that resentment against the FARC may trigger acts of violence against them. So we have to guarantee that their physical integrity will be guaranteed. This is, to me, to some extent obvious, but I would like to emphasize that because that's a fear they have. And finally, the last challenge is that the FARC is a cursed brand. So this is the challenge we are facing, because I have thought about the challenges we are facing as a society, the state is facing in terms of security, and now I would like to talk about the challenge they have to face if they want to become a political party. And this is the idea basically that they are the organization with the worst reputation in Colombia. If in the future, they need to overcome such discredit. Or maybe not, because I'm not sure about the fact that they want to, because they are attached to the cursed brand. So we'll see. It's not an easy job, of course, and I'll show you why in a minute. The problem is that they feel very different about themselves. They have been very distant from public, and the way they think about themselves is very different from the information you get from a survey or from the common Colombian that lives in a big city like Bogota. So last year, here it's the evolution of trust towards armed actors that shows you the nature of the discredit. You see that it goes, the support for armed actors is not higher right now than 3%, 2% of the population support them. Of course, this is information from surveys. You know that surveys may have a lot of bias, and probably people are not telling us the truth, but I would say that more than 10% of the population do not support them. The ceiling may be 10%. And here's the way the course works. We did an experiment last year. So we did what is called an endorsement experiment. So we randomized our sample, and half of the sample was asked, algunas personas han propuesto reservar curules del Congreso para las regiones más afectadas por el conflicto armado, con el fin de que estas regiones tengan mayor representación en el Congreso. To what extent do you support the agreement? I'm sorry about my Spanish, but and the other half was asked exactly the same question, but instead of saying some people, we said the FARC, and you can see the difference. So 31% supports the special district when you mention the FARC, but it goes up to 44% when you mention like a general, an ambiguous actor. So that's giving the perspective, of course, of the FARC. So that's their main challenge in terms of political participation. So, summing up some of the ideas I would like to stress today. The first one is that I think that the agreement on political participation may be seen as generous, but I think very reasonable. I think that's the price we as society have to pay to end up a very, very long cycle of violence. It's hard to shallow. It's for some more than for others, but I think it's reasonable. Some of the things, as I mentioned before, are part of the political discussion of the last 20 years. So, and some other things are clear concessions. Second, I think that the political participation agreement gives them the opportunity to have a political voice and making an impact. But what I like is that it gives us the opportunity to defeat them on the rules. We have to see this political participation agreement as the possibility of telling them with our votes that we don't want them, that they don't represent us. But the only way to be in that position is to have this political participation and the general agreement working. So that's something that's how I see this political participation agreement. The success of the agreement relies on three dimensions. As I mentioned before, the grand public, the Colombian state that has the responsibility of giving them the conditions to participate, and the security and in the FARC. And finally, I will finish my presentation saying that I think that the impact of the political party of the FARC will be very, very small, and it will be localized in certain regions of the country. They'll end up with power in specific regions. I don't see them as having a national impact. Maybe, political scientists, we are going to explain the past, but probably we made a lot of mistakes trying to foresee the future, but that's what I think. Maybe I'm wrong, but from the information I have, that's how I see this particular situation. So thank you very much. I'll give the word to Juan Carlos.
my best, and I want to thank you guys for inviting me to this very important event. I will speak very briefly about the referendum that we have in a little more than 1 month, and then my presentation will be really very brief, and I look forward to the questions that can and want to ask. Between the signature of the agreement and the challenges that Miguel has outlined for the post-conflict scenario, the first hurdle of the agreement we need to pass is the referendum. Here we call it the plebiscito, and probably there are technical differences between one and the other, but we will call it here the referendum. And in this referendum, Colombians are called to approve or to reject the agreement reached between the government and the FARC. In this referendum, the agreement will be considered approved if 2 conditions are met. First, if a minimum of 13% of the total number of registered voters vote yes, that is around 4.3 million people. And second, if the yes vote outnumbers the no votes. These conditions, which are new in our legislation and are exceptional regarding what previous acts have told us about referenda, were recently upheld by the Constitutional Court in a decision that is being challenged and debated because it sets exceptional rules for the referendum, for this particular referendum, different from what other similar acts have been set in the past. If the agreement is rejected, the President will not be able to implement the agreement. And it is not perfectly clear what the consequences of a no victory in the referendum will be. And some in the opposition to this process are claiming that a victory of the no will enable us to renegotiate with the FARC a better agreement in their terms, which means more penalties for the former combatants, prison sentences for the war crime perpetrators, and no participation in politics for the FARC. They say that probably a renegotiation is possible, but I think that scenario is highly unlikely. But I think, and it's highly unlikely because the arrangements regarding transitional justice and regarding political participation are central to the agreement, and the FARC would not put down their guns if these conditions are not met. So the renegotiation is probably a very highly unrealistic scenario, and probably the most likely scenario would be that the conflict will be restarted and the FARC will not be finished as an armed actor. The war will continue. That's what I think would happen if the no wins in the referendum. Now, if the referendum is approved, if the agreement is approved in the referendum, which is what I think and I deeply want will happen, then a constitutional amendment is put in place with 4 different mechanisms to implement the agreement, and these mechanisms are really powerful and strong. The first mechanism is to give the President extraordinary legislative powers to implement parts of the agreement. The President will have these exceptional legislative powers for some of the dimensions of the agreement. The second is a legislative fast track in Congress for some other bills to implement the agreement. This fast track accelerates the procedure to approve bills in Congress. And not only that, but also the government is the only agenda setter in this fast-track Congress. And also, the Congress has a close rule for these proposals. That is, the Congress can only say yes or no, but cannot amend the bill proposals introduced by the government. That's the second mechanism. The third mechanism is a multi-year investment plan to implement the agreement. And I don't have a figure in my head, but it will probably involve a lot of money for implementing this agreement. It will need a lot of money, and probably that will mean that some tax reform will be implemented and international aid will be used for that. And the fourth mechanism, which is very contentious also, is the ability to include the peace agreement with the FARC as part of the Constitution. That is to include that, here we call that the bloque de constitucionalidad. And the idea is that international treaties, for example, here, if they are approved by Congress, they become part of the Constitution. And the idea then is to treat the peace agreement with the FARC as an international treaty and to incorporate that into the Constitution. So these are very powerful mechanisms that are triggered if a yes wins in the referendum. Now, as you can imagine, several polls have been conducted regarding the vote intention of Colombians for the referendum with very, very different results. You can see, I expect, this chart in which I put all the different polls that have been made since 2015, December 2015, until a couple of weeks ago. And in some, the yes wins, in some, the no wins, the differences are high. And these differences have raised suspicions and have started debate regarding polls and the intention behind the polls, etc. I think that these polls are not comparable. Most of these polls are not comparable. And I think that is because of three factors. First, these polls have been conducted in different moments, and we have found that citizens' perceptions and opinions regarding issues related to the peace process and the agreement with the FARC are highly volatile and are conditional to everyday events. And they are also very conditional to the presidential approval. Second, not all polls ask the questions in the same way, with the same wording, or in the same order. So there is not like a standard to ask people about the referendum. That is because every poll firm uses their wording, and also because only until yesterday we know now what the question in the referendum will be. Before, the question was not known, so every poll firm asked this differently. And also, the questions are not asked in the same order. So if you ask the questions first about the vote intention, that may have a different result than if you ask that after a set of questions regarding the current situation in the country, and you can have some biases depending on the place of the question in the questionnaire. And the third reason why these differences are present in these polls is because all polls, or most of the polls, have very different sample designs. And for instance, some of the polls just interview people in large cities, some others interviewing in medium to large cities, in some regions, etc. So these opinions regarding the peace process vary a lot depending on the context in which people live. If you live in a municipality where the conflict has been really hard. The opinion toward this process is very different than if you ask in large cities, urban areas, etc. And polls have not been extremely transparent regarding what they claim the opinion of the Colombians is. So you cannot extrapolate a poll taken in 4 main cities to the general population, and the differences are probably explained by that. The campaign for the referendum has just started, and the referendum will take place on Sunday, October 3rd. The polls have not been terribly useful or informative, but we can say that the yes option is leading, and probably the question is not whether the yes will win, but the question is by which margin it will win. And that is important too, because if the victory for the yes is very close, the legitimacy of the agreement is jeopardized. So probably what the government and all the civil society organizations that promote the yes will seek is a large margin of victory for the yes in the referendum. I cannot overstate if I say that this will be the most important day in most Colombian lives. We are living a moment in history that probably most of us will never live again in our lifetimes. And I sincerely expect that it will have a happy ending. Thank you very much.
Also would like to thank Miguel and Juan for joining us, for taking the time to share their insights. I think it's fantastic. And also thank you to Scott and our colleagues here in the center. And obviously, thanks to all of you for taking the time to come here and talk about this incredibly important issue. So I want to do 3 things in keeping with the themes that were raised at the panel that's presented to me. First, I want to talk a little bit about what this peace deal means to Colombia. Second, I want to talk about what are some of the positive and negative aspects of the deal. And third, I'd like to conclude by raising some questions, issues, and other complications. Hopefully I can do all that in 10 minutes or so, because I know we have a good-sized group here, and I know people are eager to engage. And I also understand that we have some folks in the room who might even vote in the plebiscite, which I think is just fantastic. Okay, so what does the deal mean? Well, I know what I hope it means. Hopefully it means an end to the largest guerrilla organization in Colombia, an organization that has been around for over 50 years, that has engaged in a tremendous amount of political violence against people in Colombia, many atrocities. There were atrocities on all sides. Okay, there's plenty of fingers that can be pointed to all the combatants in the last 52 years in Colombia. Hopefully this deal will mean the end of the FARC as a guerrilla organization. Whether that will actually happen remains to be seen. Hopefully, the deal will lead to the demobilization of the FARC. It's 7,000 or so existing members entering the United Nations camps, or they are supposed to turn over their weapons. Hopefully, they won't be able to bury their weapons in the jungles of Colombia, but they'll actually have to turn them over. Again, this remains to be seen. Hopefully, this will lead to, instead of the FARC being a violent non-state actor that terrorizes much of Colombian society, that it will transition into something else. Miguel and Juan Carlos spoke, especially Miguel, talked a little bit about the prospects for the FARC turning itself into a political party. I really liked his points on that. You know, the MA-19, they never transitioned very well to a political party. Some individual figures like Antonio Navarro had some success, but as a party, never became wildly successful. Colombia traditionally has that strong two-party system. I don't see the FARC suddenly becoming some major national party that's going to take over Colombian politics. I think what's more likely is along the lines of what Miguel was saying. Small, local party that might have some influence in its traditional areas of control. If that keeps them from waging war in Colombia, maybe that's a good thing. Hopefully, the rebels will agree to leave the drug business and work with the government to wean farmers on coca, work with the government on alternative development. There's a lot of questions that need to be answered. Address some of those in a bit. Hopefully, it will lead to some semblance of greater justice in Colombia in the form of the special tribunals that will adjudicate the war crimes and other atrocities committed, yes, by the FARC, but also by the Parras and even government security forces. Again, there's plenty of blame to go around here, all the way around. Combatants who fully confess to their crimes, including murder and kidnapping, will not serve prison time. And this is obviously very controversial in Colombia. But if they fully confess, they will serve 5 to 8 years of, I'm going to say this with a straight face, community service, as well as some form of restricted mobility. Right? It's not perfect. All right, we can talk more about this. Nobody's saying this is a perfect deal. We're never going to have perfection. It is interesting to me that if they don't fully confess, they could be prosecuted and then face up to 20 years in prison for the crime. If they continue to engage in combat or drug trafficking, FARC members in particular could face extradition to the United States. Not something that a lot of them particularly want. Obviously, many people in Colombia feel that the tribunals, the transitional justice system, lets people off too easily. I think there's a lot of room for discussion on that point. Also, I think it's important to highlight that this does not mean that the entire country will now turn a switch and there will be no more violence. This is obviously there's a lot of work that needs to be done here. You're still going to have a lot of different violent non-state actors, the remnants of the Parras, the ELN are still around, other groups, and this has to be dealt with as well. What are some of the positive and negative aspects of this book? Okay, again, neither side got everything that it wanted. This is not a perfect piece by any stretch of the imagination. I think the British historian Malcolm Dias put it best. He said, Uribe, the war president, offers the peace the Colombians want but can't have. Santos offers the peace they don't want but might have. And that, to me, kind of encapsulates it, right? Because even Uribe did not succeed in wiping out the FARC. I mean, it had reached a stalemate. We want another war president and another 10, 15 years of fighting.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt. Miguel? Miguel?
Mute the mic.
Could you mute the mic?
Talk to the camera. ¿Puedes silenciar tu speaker porque escuchamos todo allá? Solo mientras Miguel. Okay. Sorry.
All right. I think you heard my quote from Malcolm Dias. are some of the positives? Okay, some of the positives, yes, there is an element of history here, in the sense that this is an historic achievement. Hopefully we will see greater relative peace for Colombia. Again, I'm not saying this is going to result in absolute peace and tranquility for the country, but if we can end, 5+ decades of this essentially civil war, that's a good thing. It would be fantastic if the FARC got out of the drug business. We'll see if that happens. There's obviously a lot of negatives, right? Front and center, is it too lenient, right? Particularly the transitional justice system, right? Amnesty without prison time, political representation. You have to make compromises. Unfortunately, tough choices sometimes need to be made. If this is the way to get it done, maybe we can agree that, okay, let's give it a shot. There's no land reform in this deal. I think that's a problem. Yes, there's talk about alternative development and rural infrastructure, but without land reform in some areas of Colombia, I think that will that be enough? Part of me worries about that a little bit. The agreement is very complicated. As Miguel pointed out, it runs to nearly 300 pages. Will all the voters take the time to, read over and study that and really develop the knowledge and expertise to be able to vote knowledgeably on that? That's a toughie. Obviously, the media has an important role to play in terms of helping people work through the issues. Events like this are also important. I imagine these guys are doing other events down in Colombia, down in Bogota. Is it too expensive? I think Juan Carlos brought this point up, very important. The demobilization rehabilitation program, this is going to be very expensive to implement. Who's going to pay for this, right? The U.S. government, for all the money that we put into Plan Colombia over the last 10, 15 years, are we now willing to help them on this critical component? Hopefully we will at least do our fair share. And then finally, let me end with some issues, questions, complications. Part of this is intended to be a segue for discussion from the floor. One point that Miguel raised, are Colombians really ready to let FARC members re-enter society and the political system? I'm seeing some shaking heads back there. Think about it. What if Timochenko, the FARC leader, were to be, one of these 3 congressional members? Are people ready to forgive? Maybe not forgive, but at some point we need to be ready to move on. If we're going to truly help create what's being called the new Colombia. One concern I have is who's going to protect the campesinos in areas where the FARC has traditionally functioned as a de facto state. Right? If the FARC is no longer state in these areas, who's going to keep the drug traffickers at bay? Who's going to keep the bandits at bay? These are areas where, as you know, traditionally the Colombian state has little or no presence. We know from Colombia's history that power vacuums are often filled by other non-violent non-state actors. Will thousands of rebels be successfully integrated into civilian life? As you know, some of these kids have been fighting since they were, indeed, children. This is all they've known. It's going to be a huge challenge, reintegrating these people into civilian life. Will the FARC really get out of the drug trade? What my concern here is the factionalization, potential for certain frentes or fronts, particularly areas that are really deeply involved in the trade. Are they truly going to be willing to give that up? Or are we going to have a situation where some fronts, frentes, truly do leave the business, but others do not, similar to what we saw with some of the paras in previous years, and how the industry itself might evolve from that. This is something that we've seen in Colombia historically. And then finally, many FARC leaders are wanted in the U.S. for drug trafficking and other criminal offenses, like murder, kidnapping. What do we do about that? What does the U.S. do? Is the U.S. willing to drop these cases? Are we willing to say to the Santos administration, okay, you know, let's drop these cases? I haven't seen an answer to that yet. I mean, Timochenko himself has a $5 million bounty on his head from the U.S. State Department. Okay, so obviously there's a lot of challenges here. I know people in the room have a lot of legitimate questions and concerns. At the end of the day, I'm going to be an optimist and that I hope this deal goes through, in part because, to get back to Juan Carlos's point, what's the alternative at this point? If the Colombian people were to vote no, I mean, Santos isn't just going to turn around and renegotiate another deal, right? Basically, that would be left to the next president. The FARC, they'll walk away. I mean, they've got things to do, you know, drug trade, among other things. They keep doing their thing. I think this is a real opportunity here, and I hope that we can, you know, try to make it work. I'll end with that.
Thank you. Okay, we've got about half an hour for questions. Before we do that, I just want to make sure I thank Luz Amanda. Is she here, or is she still there? There she is in the back for helping set this up. I say thank you to the other people that helped as well, Luis in particular, who was helping with the technology and work to set up with Juan Carlos and Miguel tonight. So thank you also, Luis. We have about half an hour, as I said, for the questions. I'm going to ask that people keep these brief. If they go over 2 minutes, I'm going to start I don't know, dancing on the table or something so that you'll be distracted. But please direct the question to the panel so that we can have full response and so as many people as possible can participate. Okay?
I have a very quick question about the voting status of the 10 seats minimum for the FARC, and if you can clarify if those are adding to or displacing the existing seats as well. And you may want to unmute your microphone before you answer.
Do we answer right away?
Yeah.
Okay. I would say that those will be added. Since those are temporary, there will be an extra number of representatives for 2 constitutional periods.
And can you clarify the voting status?
Pardon me, I can't hear you.
Can you clarify the voting status of those seats? There's been some confusion about that.
Who will vote? You mean who will do it?
Oh, sure, yeah. No, I get it. Thank you, Juan Carlos. The 5 seats in the Senate and the 5 seats in the House, from now until the end of this constitutional term, that means 2018, they will have voice but not vote. Once the new constitutional period starts, they will have votes and vote.
And then will they have that vote for 2 full periods, or only the 1 full period?
For 2 full periods.
Thank you.
Just want to ask some of the underlying dynamics of the peace process. What drove them to the table, and what are their basic motivations? You know, some of the panelists talked about, you know, if FARC became a political party, it would be a rather small one, right, with little effect in national politics. So what is actually their motivations? And so the question is, why now? Why are they negotiating now? And one more is the support for the peace, especially for the FARC. Is it only at the leadership level? And what is the support within the organization for the peace? Because you also talked about the threat of factionalization. So that is important. If it is only driven by the leadership, then you might face the threat of factionalization in the future. So.
I would defer to our Colombian colleagues.
I would say that the paradox here is that the peace talks are, I think, a direct consequence of the security policy of President Uribe. And it is because the FARC has been stricken by the Colombian army for the past years that they are weak enough to be seated at the table. So their motivation is that they are weaker and weaker, they are tired, they have lost a lot of their leaders, and they think, I'm not sure, but I think what they have in mind is that this is the best timing for reaching some of the things that they want without being weaker if they are struck by the army. Now, I think that the FARC, one of the characteristics of the FARC is that their command is very vertical. They are able, and they have been able, to stop all actions in the past few months. If you see the figures of violent actions in the past few months, from the moment that the FARC, the commander of the FARC in Havana, said no more actions, they stopped immediately in almost all parts of the country. So the command is very vertical and the leadership is very clear. That's different from other groups in Colombia.
I just want to talk a little more about the opposition in Colombia, because it seems to me like most of the victims of violence are pro-yes, to vote yes, but people in the cities that are not direct victims of violence are against the plebiscito. So I just want to explore, in your opinion, because I'm not living in Colombia anymore, why is that? Why do you think it's the victims saying yes and the people in the city saying no?
I would briefly say that my impression is that that's because victims know what the conflict is and they want it to end. And people in the cities have seen the conflict from afar in TV, and they don't know the cost of the conflict, and they are more or less willing to make concessions to the FARC in order to reach peace. I don't know if Miguel wants to add something.
Yeah, I'm agree with what Carlos, but I would like to add basically that the paradox of our conflict is that it's the longest, but the impact of the conflict in cities and our nation is not the same as it was, for instance, in Central America. So it's very comfortable from someone in Bogota to say no, because basically it's protecting a status quo and a situation of relative security compared to what it was the country 20, 50 years ago. So that's why. And actually our surveys, people in the cities and younger Colombians are less willing to say yes. And the youngest are the generation, I mean between 18 to 25, they are the generation that didn't see the country in the worst part of the conflict of the 90s.
The paradox is also, I'm sorry, the paradox is also that 10 years ago, the main concern of the people was the conflict. Now, after all the Uribe administration and the peace talks, for people, the conflict is a less important issue. They are more concerned about the economy and everything. So they don't see the conflict as a very compelling issue to deal with now.
As a follow-up, can I ask you to speak a little bit about how this conflict over the plebiscite has turned into a political conflict between Uribe and Santos, and what that means for the long-term consequences for the country?
That's a tough question. I mean, it's hard to explain because I think that the difference between Santos and Uribe is that Santos is a more practical politician than Uribe, and pragmatical. And Santos, I would say, I mean, I don't have evidence about it, it's only my perception, but I would say that from the beginning, Santos was the Secretary of Defense of the Uribe government, and he was behind some of the biggest, biggest actions against the FARC. But I would say that he knew from the beginning that the end of the conflict would imply a negotiation with the FARC and with the armed actors. So that's how I see that. Uribe, it's probably a mixture between a very, very radical politician with a view of the conflict and of the FARC in particular. He's a victim himself of the FARC. His father was killed by the FARC back in the 80s, I guess. That probably only imagines one solution with the FARC. I mean, beyond that, I would add also that the conflict began because Uribe felt betrayed. I recently did an analysis of the 2010 campaign, and the 2010 campaign was basically a competition among people that tried to convince us that they were copies of Uribe. So the selected one was Santos, and I think Uribe never forgives the betrayal. But probably that's part of the explanation. I think it's more complicated than that. But I would emphasize the nature of Santos as a politician versus Uribe, and they also represent very different types of politicians. Uribe represents a rural elite, regional elite, less willing to change. And Santos is a conservative, a guy who believes that the country must be modernized. From a conservative point of view, I don't think he's a progressive politician, but it's very different and represents that type of duality in Colombian politics.
I would add, however, that I could envision a third Uribe's term with a peace talk to the FARC. I mean, I think Uribe had the idea of sitting the FARC in a peace talk table, probably with very different, with a bit different agenda and everything, but I think that Uribe was thinking about putting the FARC in a negotiation in a weaker position.
I tend to disagree. I think the reason that the older generation of Colombians are against this is because they know the history. There used to be a time of Pastrana, when Pastrana gave territory to the FARC, and they almost lost that FARC, right? And we know that history. And it's not 52 years. Let me correct the thing. The conflict started in the time of Rojas Pinilla, and he was deposed in 1953. So if you add those numbers, it's more like 60-some years. My whole life, right? I have been born in 1947, the conflict started in 1948, and I have never seen peace in Colombia. And now the new generation forget some of these. Uribe seems to remember some of that. Santos seems to be in the new generation. Besides, the economy of Colombia is one of the best in Latin America. Where is Venezuela? Venezuela has an 800% problem of increasing prices every inflation. Brazil is in the dark. The countries in Central America are having a heck of a problem with violence. El Salvador is one of the most violent places in the world, right? Now, for some of us who have lived away from Colombia, it's easy to see it in a different perspective. But I am tired, as a Colombian, of seeing this for 60 years, and there's no way to solve it. Is it a perfect? No, I don't think it is. I think it could be gotten better, but I don't think that it can be renegotiated. I think this is it. And if the Colombians think that there will be another chance, I think they're mistaken.
Thank you.
I have two questions. One is, what is the role of the international community in controlling the guerrilla during the post-conflict? And the second one is, what is going to happen with the people in the army, especially those ones who are in jail because of problems with the conflict with the FARC?
Well, I will start with the second one. I think that the army will play several roles in the post-conflict. I was very surprised and pleased to hear the commander of the army saying that their role from now on is to protect the FARC combatants, so they are taking that seriously. The agreement also considers includes a piece of the parts of the transitional justice that would benefit the army. Not only the army, but civilians, businessmen that were part of the conflict will have the chance of being part of transitional justice. So I think that that's part of the agreement, and that involves the armed forces. I would like to say that that's not to equate the FARC with the army. I mean, but it's too rare. But it implies recognizing that, for instance, about 3,000 civilians between 2008 and 2010 were killed by army units and presented to the media as combatants. So that's not a small situation, and that probably will be part of the transitional justice. And second, the international community, and in particular the United Nations, will play an important role, at least in the immediate future. They are part of the process to. The FARC will put their troops in certain places, and the United Nations will be monitoring that movement of troops and before the final demobilization. But after that, I think that the international community has to be involved in this post-conflict scenario in terms of money and the fund putting money to this agreement only from the Colombian government maybe be impossible, so we need support from the international community in terms of
would you be able to give us some highlights of the consequences, like in a parallel, the figures, in terms of economic figures of what would happen in either scenario?
You mean yes or no?
Yeah. But like contrasting both outcomes in terms of the economy, or how much it would cost, what would be the highlights or the consequences of that?
I have to say that I only have one figure. I mean, some economists have estimated that the impact of the peace in the
GDP?
On the national domestic product will be an increase of about 2%. I mean, we have GDP. I mean, we cannot expect an enormous impact in terms of growing. I wouldn't say that, because we have to invest part of that money in the post-conflict situation. But that's the only thing I can say. I don't have more information about it. I'm sorry.
But if we don't, the follow-up would be, but if we say no, how much does that cost?
Well, if we say no, we remain in the situation we are, and we are lagging in terms of I mean, you have to remember that Colombia has one of the most unequal societies in the world, not only in Latin America, which is a very unequal region. We are not investing enough in education. So I think the price, we have been paying that price for the past decades. So we have to still, the no wins, we have to keep paying that price. And despite of economic growth, of course you see here a lot of rich people around the streets, but the distribution of income remains very, very unequal. And investment in education and in rural areas is very, very weak. So I think that the current situation is a good example of the near future despite of the economic growth.
I have two comments, a follow-up, and one is regarding what you mentioned, that there is no any mention of the Reforma Agraria, whereas I think there are some points in the agreement, Reforma Rural Integral, and it mentions, for instance, title land to women. Should be given cannot be alienated for at least 6 years, which I think, based on the disparity on the position of land in Colombia, I think is really important point to acknowledge. Second point was the integration of combatants into civil life. There are Colombians, there are different points of view, and as an example, we had Mancuso, paramilitary leader in Pittsburgh, studying ESL, like everybody else. So, yeah, it's going to be a process, but I agree that it's better and perfect peace process.
So, just to clarify, so I understand, the first question was about agrarian reform and how far it goes, because there are pieces of the agreement that we talk about, some land redistribution and things, right?
Right.
And then the second part about redistribution for women, is that what I understood correctly?
No, I'll say like this point that it's in the agreement, it's really important.
For women particularly?
I'm sorry?
For women particularly, did you say?
Yes, it's in the agreement it's mentioned that a particular line about that title land rights to women.
I have a question. Oh, yes. I have a question about the drug trade. So our role in the drug trade is big in all Latin America. I was seeing if they have any numbers of if we have increased our coca growers or
Double last year.
Exactly, but this has to be, the agreement with the FARC is going to minimize or increase because it's a work problem. It's something like the demand is increasing more and more, and we can see that it's not only Colombia, it's all Latin American countries involved in the drug trade, but those drug trade and the coca dealers corrupt government, bankers, the whole society, and it's coming from Latin America, Mexico, Central America. We see the violence, the armed dealers, and then we know we can count and we can pinpoint where are these drug dealers in Latin America. We can count the peasants, the dwarves, but as soon as the drug arrives in Mexico and pass the border, all the money disappear in the banking industry. We don't know where the mafiosos here in the United States, where the consumers.
Summarize or put these couple of questions together, and maybe people could comment on. A big part of the agreement is that there, as Miguel pointed out, there's tremendous poverty in the rural areas, and drugs is the obvious place to go if there's no rural development. And so parts of the reform talk about that, putting in a lot of money for economic development and being an alternative crop instead of coca. This is part of the agrarian reform, it's part of the drugs, it's part of the violence, it's part of economic development and growth. So could you talk about a little bit more about what those pieces of the economic development plan are?
So this is one of the biggest challenges, I think, with the agreement. Colombia has some experience with alternative development programs to get farmers off coca, off opium poppies. It hasn't had a tremendous amount of success, in part because it's very expensive to do
And
this.
poorly financed.
Because it was poorly financed, they didn't have the resources to do it appropriately. So in order for that part to work, the Colombian government is really going to have to step up and make a major investment in these areas that traditionally it is not given a great deal of attention to. Can we get the European Union to support some of this? Can we get the United States to support some of this? I don't think the Colombian government can do it alone. And let's not forget what is driving a lot of this essentially economic activity. At the end of the day, it's consumer demand in the West, in the United States, in Europe, and now, unfortunately, the drug markets in Latin America, in Brazil, elsewhere, have been growing a lot over the last decade or so. At the same time you see those developments, what's happening in the U.S. is actually we're moving in the opposite direction with respect to our own drug policy. We're moving more towards legalization, decriminalization, at least with cannabis. We're not talking about doing this for cocaine, but it is kind of interesting to me that that's kind of, I think it is widely acknowledged that the war on drugs is a failure as policy. I mean, this is across the political spectrum. This is widely acknowledged. And here is an opportunity to try and deal with this. But if we're going to be successful, we're talking about a massive investment in the Colombian countryside. Alternative development is hard to do. It requires a lot of money. And I don't think the Colombian government can do it alone. We have to help them. And are we willing to do so?
I would like to add to Michael's answers something else. And in terms of the drugs issue, I would like to give you a more the political perspective of the drugs issue in the agreement. And I think that it needed to be there because there's this link between the FARC and the drug trade, right? So, but it was there because there's a link between the FARC and the drug trade, and we need to admit that, I think, and they, as an organization, need to face that their involvement in the drug trade, in the drug production. But after saying that, I think that we cannot measure the success of the agreement in terms of what will happen with the drug issue in Colombia. I would say that it's very likely that the hectares of coca will increase in the near future. And that's not the way we need that's not the indicator we need to use to measure the success. The drug issue is a global issue. It's not only a matter of the Colombian government and the FARC. I agree with you, Michael, that it takes a lot of people around, and unless the global policy changes, we'll keep paying the price of the war on drugs, which is another issue.
Yeah, alternative development as a counter-drug policy is really fraught. It's hard to do, and there's not a lot of positive examples in the world to point to and say, hey, it's worked there. Yeah, it's an issue.
To the end of our time, I've seen about 3 hands, so I'm going to collect three last questions, and then we'll give them one last chance to respond.
My question is about one of the points that Miguel was highlighting is the possibility that we have now to defeat FARC in the polls. And my question is, do we really want to defeat FARC? Because now with the peace agreement, a lot of these spaces for political representation of minorities is actually a real possibility, and it's something that we are claiming our society is very unequal, and we need to get participation for minorities, for the farmers and for the people out of the cities, and then here is the opportunity, here is the space So do we really want to defeat this opportunity to represent them? I would say this is my question.
Fernando? I was wondering about the cost of this. I mean, we will need certainly, and going to be mandatory, a major tax reform to support this, as well as international support. But who's going to verify where is going this money and how it's invested? For instance, with the Plan Colombia, yes, there's going a significant amount of money there. But around, I don't know, it's a significant part that never leaves the United States. You know, it's invested in buying weapons, rent chopped helicopters, buy and modernize the army, the Colombian army, making, acquiring equipment on the United States with American companies. Then it's not that money arrived to Colombia. In this case, how this investment is going to be controlled. And for me, it's not clear in the agreements which are the instruments to control that, to verify that that money won't finish in hands of corrupt politicians, which usually happen in many cases, especially in contexts like the Colombian context, where institutions still are weak, and especially controlled institutions are especially weak and politicized. And then, where are those kind of questions in the agreement? Because yes, there are questions clearly defined about land, about political participation, which are located at the root of the conflict. But we also need to consider this kind of issues.
There's one more hand over here somewhere.
Even that we say yes.
Okay.
Provide.
Yeah, my question is regarding the trying to compare the Colombian situation with other countries. What I've read is that these kind of disagreements are really fragile, very difficult to actually be successful, and there are many examples in Central America and countries all over the world. And what I understand is that they've been trying to use what they've learned from all the failure in other countries to try to make the best possible and the most viable agreement and process. So I would like to ask, what is the innovation in this case that makes it promising and that could make it really successful amid the big risk of having a failure?
Okay. Miguel?
I'm going to start with the defeat question. Thank you for asking me that question, and that gives me the opportunity to clarify my point. Do I want them to represent me? No. Do I want the minorities and the small parties to have a voice? Yes, but that's not the same thing, right? What I'm saying is that, and I think that this agreement gives the left, the parties like Polo Democrático and other parties, an opportunity to grow, an opportunity to be in a position to promote their point of view without being accused of being part of the insurgency. And I think that, of course, for the success of this process, we need them with political power. But the fact that we have the vote in our hands to say who's going to represent us, I think that's all my point. I don't think they represent many Colombians. They represent some Colombians, so they'll have to have a representation according to the numbers, and that's all my point. And we have experience of other political parties that were created after the mobilization process, like the M19, and they were successful at the beginning, and then they were victims of their own mistakes. And that's how I see the situation. In terms of the innovations, I'm not an expert on comparative political agreements or something like that, but I compared the agreement with our previous experiences, and I think that the methodology of negotiating the peace with the FARC was the biggest innovation. Our previous experiences were a negotiation that went through the media all the time. I think that the fact that it was to some extent secret at some points, and then that they said nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, gave them the opportunity to advance and cover all the points of the agenda. But other than that, I don't have enough information to give you an answer.
My impression is that, without being an expert myself, neither, that the methodology for this peace agreement will become a textbook agreement, a textbook issue for other peace agreements. I mean, that it was observed, was with a fixed agenda, it was without the going public all the time as previous examples, and I think it will become a textbook peace agreement.
I just would like to make a quick follow-up to Miguel. My name is Carlos Ramirez from CNU. You mentioned at the beginning that you would like to be called to the next process, next step in the process. So I would invite you to be more open to minorities, if it's to be represented, if you need to represent somebody.
I think if I understood Miguel correctly, then he was very open to having that, and the idea that lowering the threshold, electoral threshold, is that any political party that can win support. And so,
yeah. When we start the conversation saying that doesn't represent me, I would like to make it more open to represent us.
So there's a campaign.
So I would invite him to be more pluralistic.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. I think it's been a good start.